All right, here we are. Oh, somebody's hello. Okay, let's see. Is everybody here? Oh yeah, I see George showed up. Very good. George Costanza. Do you have any other celebrities in the class? I don't think so. I don't see any. All right. Um, all right. Anyway, so here's what we're gonna do. Now let me get the. We're gonna switch over to Moodle for a second and see what's on here. Oh, hold on. Oh, here we go. All right, so let's take a quick look at Moodle. I think what I'd like to do here is show you a video first before we get started that will help explain in more detail where this chapter and the next one are going. If you look at the schedule here, we've already talked about consumer producer surplus, which are a buildup to our discussion about tariffs. And as you recall from last time, tariffs are basically a tax on imported goods, which are used by a government to possibly raise revenues, but more likely protect a domestic industry. And in doing so, though, of course, they raise prices to domestic consumers, and they also can
Every here agreement.
cause other problems. By, for example, we could have retaliation from,
Colors missing meaning. I thought
and then
we agreed on once.
let's just get that out of here. All right. And then on top of that, we also have other types of protectionism. We lump those together into a category called non-tariff trade barriers. For the most part, that one would be referred to as quotas, which are simply numerical limits into how much of a product can be imported into the country. So, like Japanese cars right now are subject to a numerical quota every year. The Japanese, of course, make let's say they're very good car makers, and so are American companies too. But for the longest time, the government has been protecting the domestic auto industry by limiting how many cars Japan can bring into the country every year. And now, of course, all these different types of protectionism can ultimately be counterproductive, as we'll see. But there's a video I have here, which I think we should look at, and then hopefully this will tie a lot of this together, and then we can dive into it more deeply with the notes. Okay, so this should give us some big picture information about tariffs and quotas, and then we can look at our examples in a little more detail. All right, so what I'm going to do as usual is I'm going to send you the link because, as you know, we can get into trouble by recording this as part of the video, our recording. So I'll put this in the chat room, and then you can click it on and watch it on your computer, but it will not be part of our recording. All right, so I'm going to pause the sharing for a minute, and then we're going to watch it, and we'll see how we'll see a lot of very important details about tariffs and quotas. This is Jacob Clifford. In the mid-1950s, unload the entire container, and that makes things way more efficient. Okay, I guess we're all done by now. So that was a lot of complicated ideas all jumbled together. Yes, there was a lot going on there, wasn't there? But don't you worry, we're gonna cover that in very great detail right now. Let me go get our slides open. By the way, did anyone recognize that movie that they kept referring to? I don't know why he chose that one, but does it look familiar? Now that movie is older than you guys are mainly, but you may have seen it. That's right, Napoleon Dynamite. Oh yes, it was an independent film. It was made in the early 2000s, and let's obviously the star of the show, Napoleon, is a very strange guy, and it's all about his life. But it's a very good movie, and you might want to check it out. So that's why you kept seeing those scenes with that strange guy. That was Napoleon Dynamite. And so let's just say he's not exactly a popular guy. He's not very talented. He's not very anything, but he is the star of the movie. And so anyway, why don't we get our notes going here? And let's see. Let me get our. Here we go. All right. So this is 4. Now we've already looked at the appendix, which is where we discussed consumer and producer surplus. So now we're applying these to tariffs. And so again, just a quick reminder, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. So some percentage or some dollar amount is added to the import price of a good by the US government. So when the product comes into the US, the price or the tax is added to it, and then it reaches the consumers, and then they can feel free to buy this product at the higher price, or instead, maybe what they're hoping you'll do is instead buy the cheaper domestic, or actually, sorry, the more expensive domestic product. So, like the example that you might think of is, let's say, liquors, especially, tend to be very heavily taxed when they come in from foreign countries. I guess the government feels like, not only are we raising money for ourselves, and not only are we helping the domestic liquor producers, but maybe we're even reducing the consumption of liquor, which might be a good thing. So anything that's imported, like let's say Kahlua from Mexico or rum from the Caribbean, it's going to be a lot more expensive than it would be um, in those actual countries. In other words, if you travel to one of those countries, you'll find that those liquors are quite a bit cheaper than they are in the United States. And the reason for that is, of course, because of the tariffs. The products aren't that expensive, but the US government imposes these tariffs, and that forces the price up to a higher level to make it easier for the domestic producers to compete with foreign producers. So now, of course, that's all sounds very wonderful in practice. You're helping the domestic producers, but you're also causing problems for the domestic consumers. And as we'll see, it also leads to a lot of what we'll call dead weight losses, because what you're essentially doing is reducing the choices that are available to consumers, and you're forcing them to pay higher prices for the products that they want. So there's some benefits, but in general, the costs of this policy will typically be greater than the benefits. But the reason why they continue to exist is because the benefits are usually concentrated in a handful of people or businesses, and the costs are usually spread out over a very large number of consumers who may not even be aware that this is taking place. So in other words, if let's say the domestic liquor producers get together and they petition Congress for tariffs on imported liquor, then they're more likely to get a hearing from the Congress. Whereas if consumers are annoyed that their liquor costs are so high, it's hard to imagine that enough of them could get together and complain to Congress that maybe this is not the best policy, because they're not really losing out that much, whereas the liquor producers are gaining a lot from tariffs. So they have a very powerful incentive to make sure that these stay in place, whereas the consumers have less of an incentive because it doesn't affect their lives as directly. Anyway, so a tariff is a tax on imports, and it may take one of several forms. Ad valorem is Latin, and it just means it's a percentage of the value of the imported item. Sales taxes, for example, are ad valorem taxes because they're a percentage of the total. In other cases, the tariff might be a fixed amount, in other words, X dollars per unit. And in some cases, there might be a combination of both, compound tariffs. I don't really know exactly how they make these decisions, what gets taxed at what rate. But the bottom line is that no matter how it's imposed, these tariffs make it more expensive for consumers to buy imported products. Now, we've already gone over this effective rate of protection. What's essentially showing us is that sometimes the amount that we are paying for this protection is maybe higher than we generally realize. So we've already done this part. Let's jump ahead over this and let's look at our first tariff. And so what we'll notice, as they said in the video, is that what happens with a tariff is that the producers are happy. Domestic producers are very happy to see tariffs because this raises their producer surplus. There's less competition. The competitors are being forced to charge an artificially high price for their product. And so that makes it easier for domestic producers to sell to the domestic market. That raises their producer surplus. The problem, though, is that consumer surplus is going to fall because we will end up having less of the product and paying a higher price for it. So the consumer surplus may fall by a much larger amount than the increase in producer surplus, even combined with the tariffs that are being paid to the government. Because when a tariff is imposed, that tax money goes into the pockets of the government, which you would like to think they're spending it on something wise or sensible or that's actually needed. Whether that's the case or not, typically when we compare these two benefits, they often fall short of the cost imposed on the consumer. And so when that happens, as they showed in the video, we end up experiencing what's called dead weight loss, which means those are losses that do not benefit anyone. Okay, so this is one of the big arguments against tariffs, that they introduce this dead weight loss on consumers and give an advantage to certain producers when maybe there's no reason why they deserve those benefits. I mean, really, when you stop and think about it, why should one group of producers be protected against foreign importers when others are not? So it's always, trade policy is always very controversial. So in free trade, we have this example with the bicycles. And what happens in this example, we have our traditional supply and demand curves. And you can see we've already started to work on this example. That what's happening, though, is that the domestic producers can produce bicycles, but the equilibrium price in the United States in this case would be $350. And at that price, we consumers in the United States would buy 1 million bicycles. All right. Now, there's just one problem. Foreign producers can make bicycles more cheaply. They have a comparative advantage in the production of bicycles. And so because of that, foreign countries can make all the bicycles we want for $300 each. And that puts the domestic producers in an awkward position. So what ends up happening is that if there's no interference, what happens is the domestic producers, according to the supply curve, are willing to produce up to 0.6 million bicycles for a price of $300. So those bicycles will be bought in the United States. There's no cost advantage to the consumer to buying foreign bicycles up to this point. But then after that, the domestic price continues to rise. And so now we're going to turn to the foreign market. And at this low price of $300, we're going to buy 1.6 million bicycles. Okay, this is the intersection of the world price with the domestic demand curve. But since only 0.6 million are being produced in the United States, where are the rest of them coming from? Imports, we're buying it from abroad. We're buying 1 million foreign bicycles. 0.6 million are coming from home, and the other 1 million are coming from abroad. And so we're reaching an equilibrium, even though the domestic producers would require a price of $350. Instead, this horizontal distance is what we have for imports, and that brings our total consumption to 1.6 million bicycles. So right now, the green triangle represents consumer surplus. And as we know, the area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. The base is 1.6 million units, which is the total amount that we're buying between imports and domestic production. The height is the difference between this price line and this vertical axis, because we're trying to capture everything between the price and the demand curve. And why is this consumer surplus? Because everybody in this triangle is paying less for the bicycles than they were willing to pay. Everyone in this triangle is getting a bargain. And that bargain is referred to as consumer surplus. So when we multiply this out, 1/2 of the base of 1.6 times the height of 540 brings us to $432. Well, actually, it's millions, because this is in millions. All right, 432 million. The producer surplus is pretty small because they're not selling a whole lot of bicycles. Why not? Because we do not have the comparative advantage. Now, according to David Ricardo, they should probably just stop making bicycles in the US altogether and try to switch to something different. But it's not as easy as it sounds. Like we've seen in an earlier chapter, the capital that's being used and the labor that are used to make bicycles are not perfectly transferable into another industry. So there will always be these bicycle companies who continue to try to produce in spite of the presence of competition throughout the rest of the world. So here they are. The last survivors are making 0.6 million bicycles at a price of 300. So the producer surplus is this red triangle. Everything from the price line down to the supply curve is our producer surplus. And so, again, the area of this triangle is 1/2 base times height. The base is 0.6 because the domestic producers are only making 0.6 million bicycles. The height is everything from the supply curve up to this price line. This is 90. And so that area is 27. The grand total is $459 million. That's the total surplus earned by consumers and producers. Okay, well, now what's going to happen? The domestic producers say, listen, maybe we should go to Congress and ask for an import tariff. Well, if they have enough political clout, they can probably get one imposed on these products. And of course, what ends up happening is that this group will end up making donations to the politicians who make it possible to have a tariff. That's how it's done. So now let's see what happens when a tariff does happen to be imposed. So ultimately, what will happen is the domestic price will rise. Domestic producers will make more bicycles, but consumers will demand fewer bicycles. Okay, the price will be artificially increased. So the producers can make more bikes, but consumers will buy fewer of them. And in addition, we'll buy fewer bicycles from abroad. Consumer surplus will fall probably by a considerable amount. The producer surplus will go up by some amount. And the government will actually receive tariff revenues. Those tariffs, those taxes are actually going to the pocket of the federal government. But in general, when this happens, the total surplus, including the tariffs, will be lower than it was with free trade. So that's kind of the bottom line. Total surplus falls, and that's even including the tariff revenues when a tariff is imposed. Okay, so that means there'll be the difference or the loss of total surplus is referred to as, and we call it dead weight loss because it benefits no one. Dead weight loss. And so this concept is often used to show how a policy affects the country. And if there's dead weight loss, that typically means that the policy is counterproductive and maybe they should think twice about it. All right. Now, it doesn't always work that way, of course. Otherwise, maybe we wouldn't have any tariffs. But the powers that be have to make these decisions. And if they feel like the consumers will rise up and vote them out of office, they probably would not feel so comfortable imposing tariffs. Now, there's another consideration here too, which we haven't mentioned, but if, let's say the United States suddenly comes along, and let's say the bicycles that we're importing are coming from, let's say South Korea. If we impose a tariff on these bicycles, it's going to cause losses in the bicycle industry in Korea. So what is one possible reaction to this by the South Korean government? What might they decide to do? They're not going to say, oh no, what can we do about it? There are things they can do. Like what? How about if they impose their, oh, go ahead.
They might impose their own tariff on a popular import coming in from the United States into Korea.
Exactly. So suppose they decide to slap a tariff on the import of computer chips. What does that do to Intel? All of a sudden, you're helping the bicycle producers, but you're harming one of your best industries, the computer chip industry. So you're not only imposing a dead weight loss, but you're inviting retaliation from your trade partners. And this does happen quite a bit. Countries, sometimes they impose tariffs just to punish their trade partners for whatever actions they seem to have taken. And so you can start to find yourself in what's called a trade war if now the US retaliates with more tariffs on South Korea. And so, it can lead to a lot of problems beyond what we're seeing here. And so there are organizations like the World Trade Organization whose job is to try to keep trade interferences as low as possible. So they sit down and negotiate with these different countries and try to convince them to maybe keep this protectionism down to a minimum. And, for the most part, it's been pretty successful. Probably tariffs and quotas are lower than they would have been without the World Trade Organization. But, there's always controversy about any kind of trade policy because it directly impacts consumers and producers in all the countries involved. Anyway, so here we have an example of a tariff. Now, let's say we'll keep it simple. Let's assume that a 10% ad valorem tariff is imposed on bicycles. So at the moment, the price will jump up from $300 to $330. Okay. And that extra $30 per imported bicycle goes in the pockets of the government. But look what happens. Okay. At the new higher price, we're going to see that domestic producers will increase their output from 0.6 to 0.8 million bicycles. Okay. Why? Because they can. Before, if they tried to charge $330 for their bicycles, they would have lost a lot of revenues. Here, with the tariff in place, they can produce bicycles up to $330, which means that they're now producing 0.8 million instead of 0.6. And so the new producer surplus is here. So then what we can do, and I think we've done this at the end here all in one big chart somewhere, but let me just show you quickly right now what impact this has on the producer surplus. So you can see that we went from G to A plus G. All right. So let's see if we can figure out real quickly how much of a change this makes. All right, let's do some math here. Now, we can do one of two things. Now, remember before we saw that the producer surplus was 27 million. Now we can add A, but here's the problem with A. It's not a rectangle and it's not a triangle. What kind of shape is this, by the way? Who remembers what that is called? Take your mind back to grade 11 or 10. Starts with a T. It's a trapezoid. That's right. And does anyone remember trapezoid? Yes. The formula for calculating the area of a trapezoid. I bet you don't. So we're going to do it slightly differently. By the way, I don't know about you. This reminds me of a U.S. state. Which one does it remind you of? It also starts with a T. No. Tennessee. Doesn't it look like Tennessee on the map? Of course it does. Well, why don't we prove it? Just real fast. Yeah. You see what I mean? You see it now. Oh, that's not very big, is it? I thought I could make it. Oh, what? Hold on. Oh, now they've chopped off some of it. All right, but it just reminds me of Tennessee. But all right, anyway. So seriously, here's what we're going to do. We're just going to calculate the new total producer surplus minus what it was previously. We don't have to deal with the trapezoid. So the new producer surplus is equal to, remember, it's 1/2 base times height. The base is now 0.8 because we're now selling 0.8 units, 0.8 million, I should say. The height is 210 up to 330, which is 120, which is $48. So it has increased of 19. Okay, so that means this trapezoid has an area of 19. So the total is 48. So that's one of the benefits of this. But on the other hand, the consumer, look what happened to the consumer. The consumer is paying $330. And how many bicycles are they buying now? Well, at the world plus tariff price plus tariff, that means if you look at the demand curve, they're now only buying 1.4 million bicycles. So they're not going to be very happy, are they? They're not only paying more $30 more, but they're getting 0.2 million fewer bicycles. Okay, so the consumer surplus is now, let's color this in real fast. Let's try a different color here. God, what else do they have here? I'm looking for a color that looks cool, but it's not so pale that you can't see it. How about this shade of blue? So this is the new consumer surplus. That is kind of faint, isn't it? Let me switch back to black. 1/2 base times height. Now you wait and see. We're going to be very upset when we see this result because the new base is 1.4. Okay, from here to here is 1.4. The height is now 190. from 330 up to 540. Oh, sorry, 210. So we have, it is now worth $147. What was it before though? It was 432 something. $432. Oh no. So the loss of consumer surplus, it looks pretty big, doesn't it? Negative 285. Now the producers gained 19, and look at, we, the consumer, lost 285. Ooh, now here's something we have to keep an eye on. Now the government is earning tariffs though. And you can see the horizontal distance between B and D represents the number of bicycles we brought into the country. All right, because we are buying 1.4 million, of which 0.8 are being produced domestically. So this is our import quantity. And the government is charging $30 per bicycle for a tariff. So this rectangle represents tariff revenues. And that's equal to 1/2. Actually, it's not, sorry, this is a rectangle. There's no 1/2. It's just base times height, which is 0.6 million imported bicycles at $30 each. That's 18. Wow, that's not much. Wow, look at that. So we gained $19 in producer surplus and $18 worth of revenues, but the consumer lost $285. So that means something happened. The total surplus, the new total surplus is 147 from the consumer, 48 from the producer, 18 from the tariffs, which adds up to 147 plus 48 plus 18 is 213. The old total surplus was, and let's go look it up. I had it here somewhere. 459. Ooh, that's a big loss. So guess what? That means our dead weight loss, which I'll put down here somewhere, because there's no room, is the difference between the two, which is minus $246. Okay. That's a lot of loss. All right. So what do we say about this? Was this a smart move? Well, you know what? I mean, Congress is happy because they're getting more votes and the government's bringing in revenues and the producers are happy. But the consumers are very unhappy. In fact, as they showed in the video, the dead weight loss is usually illustrated as these two triangles right here. Okay. So, and we'll work on plenty of these examples. Don't worry. I know it's a lot to take in all in one shot, but I hope you're seeing the logic behind what we're doing. Yes, that's right. Okay, so that's the tariff. That's a 10% tariff. So at the new higher price, the domestic quantity supplied rises, the quantity demanded falls, imports fall. Now, if you want to analyze this, you can do this with the letters too. Um, Something's not right. Let me see something. I think there's a mistake in here somewhere. Let me just check something out here. We had 1/2 base times height. Oh, you know what? This one, there's a mistake on this page. I just noticed it. Let me just fix this real fast. I knew something was wrong. Okay. So the old consumer surplus wasn't quite as high as we thought. I made a typo in there. Sorry. So it's 0.5 times 1.6 times 240 is only 192. All right. So the losses aren't quite as great as we thought, but still they're pretty significant. We had 192 here. The total would have been 219. Yeah, that's a little bit more like it. So now when we do the comparisons, let me make a few changes here. Okay, so this part hasn't changed. This is fine. It's a consumer surplus that's off. The old consumer surplus wasn't 432. It was actually 192. All right, let's fix that. That's better. So the loss of consumer surplus is 45. That's still going to leave us behind because you can see that the new total surplus, let's fix that. No, this part is fine. Let's leave it. 147 plus 48 plus 8 is 203. The old total surplus okay, so the old total surplus was, let's see, what was it? 219. All right, now I lost my place. There it is, 219. So the loss is 16. That's dead weight loss. We'll call it DW loss. And so that makes a lot more sense because if you look at those purple shaded triangles, let's see, what do we have here? I've got the calculations right here. Okay, so yeah, the gain to the producer is 19. The gain to the tariffs is 18. Let's see, the consumer goes from, loses 45. That's it. Okay. So let's do it this way. Hold on one second. It'll be a lot quicker to do it this way. So the gains are 19 in producer surplus, 18 in tariffs. We lose $45 in consumer surplus. So the net difference is 8. All right. So we have deadweight loss equal to 8. All right. But the bottom line is that no matter how you look at it, we're losing more than we're gaining. Okay. Okay. Now we're ready for what comes next. What happens if, oh, okay, so we can change our analysis. We're assuming basically that the country imposing a tariff is a small country. And what that means then is that the price that we charge does not affect the rest of the world. Basically, we'll charge the same price as everybody else. If we're a large country, though, that's going to change. So we do need to have a separate type of analysis when we have a large country versus a small country. So a large country can influence the world price of a good. And you might occasionally run into this word in economics. It's called monopsony power. It looks weird, doesn't it? Monopsony. We know what a monopoly is. One seller. A monopsony is a little different. That means there's one buyer. Now, when would you ever see this in the real world? Imagine yourself working in a little town in the middle of nowhere. Here's your little town, and there's only one employer in that town. There's one big store, and that's it. They hire everybody. The store would then be in this position of a monopsonist in the sense that they're the only buyers of labor in that town. So they can more or less determine what to pay you because that's it. If you don't work for them, you've got to move somewhere else, and that could be very costly. So the same thing can be said if we're a large country. What may happen is if we have a tariff, let's say we're the US and we have a tariff on bicycles. And let's say the tariff is $30. The foreign producers may say, you know what, the US is our major market. We don't want to lose any market share. So here's what we'll do. We'll absorb some of that cost and we'll allow our profits to be reduced in order to maintain our market share. So let's say that they absorb $20 of this tariff, and therefore the price only rises by $10. So now some of this tariff money is actually coming out of the pockets of foreign producers. And it will also have a less disruptive effect on the domestic consumer because the price is only going up by $10. And yet the full benefits, well, not the full benefits, but still the domestic producers are still gaining, but there's less impact on the consumers. So we're going to see a separate case for when this actually happens. And before we do that, though, we need to introduce this very important definition here. The terms of trade for a country equals export prices over import prices. Now, clearly, we want this ratio to be as high as possible. A country like the US, being as big as it is likely to have very good terms of trade compared to other countries that are more dependent on trade because their GDP depends more on trade than ours does. Okay, so it's kind of like, let's say, imagine Walmart negotiating with their suppliers. Okay, so Walmart, suppose they decide to buy and sell in their stores Tide detergent, let's say. If they buy Tide, they're going to buy a lot of Tide, and I mean a lot of it. They may be Tide's biggest customer. So when it comes time to negotiate the price, what do you think is going to happen? Is Tide going to be able to charge them a high price or a low price? Well, Tide will have to receive a relatively low price because this is their big customer. Low. Since Walmart is their best customer or their biggest customer. They have the power to do this. If they say, no, Tide, that's too much money, we're going to buy somebody else's product, Tide could lose a lot of their revenues. So they're going to charge, or Tide is going to charge a low price, low enough to make, I mean, not so low that they can't make money, but they're going to try to make up for it with volume. And so the US is kind of in the same position. We're in a position to negotiate very favorable terms of trade with other countries because we may be their biggest customer. Okay, so we're negotiating with Brazil, let's say, and Brazil says, the US buys most of our coffee. Therefore, we want to negotiate favorable prices to the United States. We don't want to lose them as a customer. So this is expressed by the so-called terms of trade. The ratio of export to import prices is a reflection of what kind of position you're in. The higher this ratio, that means the stronger bargaining position you have in international trade. All right, so when a large country imposes a tariff, of course, the domestic demand for imports drops, as we've seen, but unlike the other examples, the world price of the good will drop as well. Because the American market is so massive that if we buy less bicycles, let's say, the price will actually drop throughout the entire world. Now, what that does then is that it reduces what we call marginal costs for foreign producers. Now, let's take a little bit of a detour here. Just for a second, because we're talking about concepts that you might run into in microeconomics, but you might not have seen this before. Let me just quickly run through a few key terms with you here. First of all, the cost of production for any firm can be divided into two basic types. We have variable costs. These increase as more output is produced. And then we have fixed costs. which these do not change, or these are independent of the level of output. So let me just show you a few quick examples of this. Let's say that, think of an example. For example, a Starbucks has the following costs. All right, now imagine if they don't own the building that they're using, but they're renting it. The rent would be a fixed cost. All right, they pay X dollars a month, no matter how much they produce or how much they sell. The manager's salary. Let's say there's more than one. They don't get paid based on how much coffee is sold, do they? No, they get paid so much per year, and that's the end of it. Whether one cup is sold or 1,000 cups. Let's say fees that are required. Let's say the government requires fees. That you need a license to sell coffee in New York State, things like that. And there could be like certain types of taxes imposed, so on the other hand, variable costs are the things that increase directly with the amount of coffee that we're selling. That would be things like coffee beans. Obviously, the more coffee we sell, the more beans we have to buy. How about milk, sugar, cups? How about cinnamon? If we don't sell any coffee, nobody's going to sprinkle cinnamon on it. There's nothing to sprinkle it on, etc. So the total cost of producing Starbucks coffee is just the sum of these two. The total cost of production equals the sum of the fixed and variable costs. Now, we often see calculated the average total cost is the total sum, or the ratio of total costs divided by output. That's a huge number. So let me show you a quick numerical example. Suppose, for example, that let's say a small local Starbucks has fixed costs of, let's say, $100,000 and variable costs of, let's say, $1 per cup of coffee. The cost of making 200,000 cups is 100,000 in fixed costs plus $1 times, 200,000 equals 300,000. So it actually costs us $300,000 to make those coffees. So therefore, the average total cost in that case, well, it works out just by coincidence. The average total cost is therefore the total cost of 300,000. But remember, we sold 200,000 cups. Equals $1.50 per cup. Okay, so that means if we charge $1.50 a cup, we are breaking even, or in other words, earning what we call zero economic profits. Anything we charge above that, let's say we charge $2 a cup, then our profits are, okay, so it's a $2 minus $1.50 per cup that it costs to make them. And remember, we're selling 200,000 cups. So therefore, we make $100,000 in profits. Excellent, and that's good. Now, here's where it gets interesting. If we produce more and more units of the coffee, the cost, the variable costs typically increase. And so the marginal cost, or cost of producing one more unit of coffee, also increases, right? So therefore, in order to make more coffee, what that implies is that in order, if we have more customers, we may have to raise our price, because producing more and more coffee becomes more and more difficult with the fixed resources that we have. So if you were to draw a plot of these cost curves, what you're going to see is something like this. In a normal setting, if you were to plot, let's say, dollars on the vertical axis, Q is output. The average total cost typically falls for a while, and then it starts to rise again. The marginal cost typically falls for a while, and then it starts to rise again. But once it starts to rise, it tends to rise very, very quickly. And so this is, by the way, marginal cost. This is average total costs. So at first, when we produce more output, the marginal cost drops, but then after a while, it starts to rise again, and then it will rise forever after that. And that's because it becomes harder and harder to find the resources that we need to produce our products. In the case of the Starbucks, what starts happening is that in order to make more coffee, we need to hire more workers, but they only have so much equipment, they only have so much coffee, so the cost goes up. So this means that as output rises, after a certain point, marginal costs increase. And therefore, increasing our output will typically require us to raise the price of the good. So let's tie that back now to what we were doing here. So that's why I wanted to take the side detour so this next piece makes sense. Let's go back to where we were. Here it is. So if the large country imposes a tariff, this reduces the world price of the good so that foreign producers make less of the product and their marginal costs start to fall. Okay, so this cuts both ways. If we make less of the product, let's say we were here, we're producing 1,000 units of this product, and the marginal cost is, let's say, I don't know, $10. If we cut back on that to, let's say, 500 units, the marginal cost now is down to about, let's say, $5. It's actually becoming cheaper to produce this good because we don't have these enormously rising marginal costs. So what that's saying here is that if the large country imposes a tariff on foreign countries, because of our clout, because this is going to affect world prices, output falls in the rest of the world, prices drop, but then so do marginal costs of production. And what does that have to do with anything? That means they can lower their prices in order to maintain their market share. It's vitally important not to lose the American market. So like I was saying before, if the tariff is $30, we might discover that the price isn't going up by 30. The domestic price is only going up by, let's say, 20. Why? Because the foreign producer absorbs some of the cost of the tariff in order to maintain market share. And they can afford to do it because their own costs of production are falling. Don't worry, we'll see this when we get to the graph. You'll see it makes more sense. It's very complex right now, but when you see the graph, I think you'll realize that it's not as bad as it sounds. In other words, all we're saying is that no matter what the tariff is, the domestic price is not necessarily going to go up by the full amount if it's a large country that's imposing the tariff. If it's a small country, most likely it'll go up by the full amount. All right, so let's look at this example. We start out with 300. Now this time, let's say the tariff is only $6. It's not 30, it's 6. But it's a large country. So the price is being reduced to $297 for domestic consumers in those countries. The tariff, though, pushes the price up to $303. All right, so let's say this is South Korea. So in South Korea, the bicycles will now sell for $297 instead of $300. But in the United States, the tariff brings that up to $303. So let's see what the impact is on consumer and producer surplus. Ooh, look at this. Now it's getting really messy because we've got a world price. We've got the Korean lower price in their own market. And we've also got a tariff which raises the price in the United States. So it's really getting complicated here. Yes, very complicated. So now we got to make heads or tails out of all these areas. Wow, look at this. And you can see that the US is now importing the difference between those two, which is, let's try that, 158 minus 0.62, 0.96. 0.96 million bikes. Now, the interesting thing here, though, is that the tariff, in spite of the appearances here, is actually $6. Even if the Korean company lowers their price, the US government is still collecting $6 per bicycle. So therefore, their revenues will be this whole area here. So C and E represent the US government's tariffs. Okay, so how much is that worth? Now remember, this is a rectangle, base times height. The base is this difference of 0.96. The height is the gap between these two numbers, $6. And so the government's revenues are 5.76. What about everybody else? Okay, producer surplus increases by this amount. There's that Tennessee shape there again. So compared to free trade, You can think of this as the increase in producer surplus. The total, it comes all the way down here, but the increase in producer surplus is the area of this trapezoid. By the way, if you're not sure, here's what you can do. All you have to do is break this down into a rectangle and a triangle. Yeah, it's a little bit confusing, but so the rectangle has an area of 0.6 times the height, which is 3. And this triangle here is very small. 1/2, base is 0.02. The height is also 3. Wow, let's see what this turns out to be. $1.83. So then the big question is, what about consumer surplus? Consumer surplus falls by this entire block here. I'll tell you what, let me color this in with another color. And the reason for that is because with free trade, consumers would get 1.6 million bicycles at a price of 300, but now they're getting 1.58 at a price of 303. So the loss of consumer surplus is this whole area in here. Actually, we don't even have to color it in. That whole area is the loss of consumer surplus. The reason why I want to leave it like that, and by the way, I've already done that calculation in advance. The consumers are losing oh, maybe I didn't. Oh, hold on. All right, well, let's figure it out. I thought I had that done in advance. So what you can do is think of this as one big rectangle. Everything over here, that's going to be a base of 158. The height is 3. This triangle right here has an area of 1/2. The base here is 0.02. And the height is 3. All right, let's see what we got. $4.77. Okay. So therefore, let's see, let's add these up. We've got 576. Wow, that's different than I expected. Hold on a second. What do we do here? This consumer surplus was this amount. Did I do that right? 1.58 times 3. And then we have 1/2 of 0.02 times 3. Okay, producer surplus went up by 0.6 times 3. All right. Let me just make sure this is right. Yeah, that's right. So the imports are of 0.98, and they collect $6 each. Hmm. So yeah, consumer surplus goes down, A, B, C, D. Producer surplus goes up by A, right? And then tariffs are C plus E. So let's see, now something's not right. So if we do it with letters, let's do it with the letters. Hold on 1 second. Tariffs are C plus E. Okay, there's no problem there. The producers gain A. But the consumer surplus decreases by A plus B plus C plus D. So if you combine those, you should have C plus E plus A minus all of these, C, so let's call this A plus C plus E, minus A minus B minus C minus D. And so you should get E minus B minus D. Okay, so E is worth, let's try that. E is worth 3 times 0.96 equals 2.88. And then B and D are both triangles. So it looks like in this case, the triangles are fairly small. This B has an area of 1/2 of 3 times base of 0.02. That's only 0.03. Well, there you go. That's the reason. It looks like the tariffs are worth enough in this case to offset the loss of producer consumer surplus. So that's why the numbers represent a net gain. So is that what we got? Yeah, because here you can see the gain is 759 minus 477. So that's a gain of 282. So the graph is fine. It's just that normally it doesn't work this way. Usually there's dead weight loss in these cases. So here, because the dead weight loss is so small, these numbers, I mean, they're not really drawn as well as they could be. But it appears that in this case, the tariffs are enough to offset the loss of consumer surplus. So when combined with the producer surplus, we actually came out ahead. But like I said, it isn't normally the way it works. And the reason why this is happening is because the foreign producers are absorbing a large percentage of the tariffs. So if there are any losses, they're coming out of the pockets of the producers in the foreign countries. So if the portion, there it is. Okay, this is the key to the whole thing. If the portion of the tariff paid by the foreign producers is greater than the dead weight loss, which it is here, then the large country is better off. So that's why this is happening. In other words, normally you'd be comparing C with B and D, but here, this E, if it's being paid by the foreign producers instead of domestic consumers, that's why we can actually come out ahead, which is exactly what happened here. So you'd never get away with this in the small country. As we saw with the small country, we had dead weight losses. But here, because this is a large country, a large percentage of the tariffs, half of them, are paid by the foreign producers. And so because of that, there's not only not a loss of surplus, there's actually a small gain. Now, E, as we've seen, has an area of 2.88. So that means that had the foreign producers not paid the tariff, instead of having a gain of 288, we would have had a loss of 0.06. So in the small country case, these two triangles, orange, these would have represented our dead weight loss. But instead, with all this extra tariff revenue that the foreigners are paying, we actually end up with a small surplus. And that's again because this is a large country. Okay, back here with the small country, that's exactly what did not happen. All right, we ended up with a definite loss of dead weight loss. All right. So now what remains to be done here, now this section is completed, but what comes next is our discussion about quotas. Now, quotas are different because they're just a numerical limit of imported products. I mean, there's a limit to how much can come in. Quotas do not raise any revenues for the domestic government. So as you can probably imagine, it's going to be very hard for us to avoid losing any surplus if we just simply impose a quota. So in chapter 5, which we'll be looking at next, that's exactly what we're going to see. Yeah, the first case, in the first case, we were the small country. In the second case, we're the large country. So you have to imagine, I mean, I know it's the US, we're always the big country, but in the first case, let's pretend that we're a small country. And in the second case, we're the big country. So, if you want to think about it this way, in the first case, this is the US in the 1800s, when we really were a small country. Okay. And now the second graph is now when we are the big country. All right, so this is the small country case. Yeah, that was confusing. I should have said that right up front. We're assuming that we're a small country in this graph. And in the second case, we're a large country. And that's why the results are so different. In this case, we're virtually guaranteed to lose money, or surplus at least. In the second case, we potentially at least could gain as long as the foreigners are paying most of the tariff. Okay, instead of the domestic consumer. So again, here, the domestic consumer is paying the entire tariff. In the first example. In the second example, the foreign producers are paying it. And that's what makes the difference. We don't care what happens to them. As long as our own domestic consumers are not paying the tariff, we could potentially be better off from the tariff. All right. Well, that was a lot. I know that was a lot. We'll go through it again. We'll make sure we understand it. But I just want to point out that the next chapter 5 is where we start to look at quotas for the first time. And the big difference you'll see is that we're not gaining any revenue. So it's much harder to earn a profit. It's much less likely that we'll be better off because of the quota than we were with that tariff, even if we're the big country. So yeah, the differences are, you'll see that this time we're shifting the supply curve around as a result, and that's going to be how we analyze our quotas. All right. All right, anyway, so that's that. I guess that's enough for now. We're going to look at a few other things in here. Now, by the way, this is the end of international trade. This part will be done after this chapter 5. Then we can switch our attention to international finance, where we're looking more at, flows of goods between countries, but also we're looking at currencies for the first time. We're looking at the dollar and what determines the strength of the dollar. We'll be looking at economic variables like, interest rates and inflation rates and monetary policy and how the Fed operates and how it affects trade surpluses and deficits. So we're kind of taking a switch, maybe we're looking right now at the small picture. Once we start international finance, we'll really be looking more at the big picture. So, all right, anyway, I think that's enough for now. So in the meantime, just keep reading the slides. And we'll eventually get to a point where we can have some problem sets to work on, because we definitely need some practice. And then we'll just take it from there. All right, so how are we doing? Okay, well, all right, unless there's any last minute questions, we're going to stop right here, and I'll see you all again on Thursday.
Have a great day.
All right, you too.
Have a great day.
All right, you too. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.